Good morning, everybody. As Tom said, my name is Mark Sargent. I am the sales engineer for the Mid-Atlantic, and today's tech tips and tricks is about SMTP. I decided a couple of months ago that it might be a good idea to revisit some SMTP commands that we can do in some of our proxy settings that we have in our Fireware OS. Because there's a lot of hidden things in there that, by default, folks just don't either understand what they do or don't manipulate them to their satisfaction. There's a lot of settings in there that are designed for protecting and manipulating your SMTP traffic. I understand that a lot of organizations are moving more to cloud-based email, so this doesn't necessarily pertain to anybody who's moved to Office 365 or Google Mail, but there is still a great number of folks who have on-premise mail servers, and that's what the SMTP proxies are designed to protect. There's a couple of different SMTP proxies that are built into our Fireware OS. And if anybody who's been familiar with WatchGuard for a while understands that when you first set up your SMTP proxies, that you cannot change those, you can clone those. And the reason why is because obviously we don't want somebody to make changes to the default configuration and then not be able to revert back. So if you look at the SMTP proxies that are available, you have the SMTP incoming, the SMTP incoming.standard, the SMTP outgoing, and SMTP outgoing.standard. The .standard ones were introduced a couple of years ago, and they actually are a little bit less restrictive than the old SMTP incoming and SMTP outgoing. And the reason why they made a decision to do that is a lot of folks they found weren't taking advantage of our proxies because they would implement the default settings on the proxies, and inevitably something would break, and so they would revert back to packet filters. And that was kind of the reasoning behind why I wanted to do this webinar today. Is there's a lot of things that you miss if you're only using packet filters for your SMTP traffic. So without further ado, I'm sure you can all see my screen right now. And I want to talk about a couple of the settings here under the General Settings tab. So this is an outgoing proxy policy that I have listed here. And under the General Settings, a couple of things that I wanted to point out. So in the Limits box, let me, hold on a second here. In the Limits box at the top of the screen, you can see that you have set the maximum number. Now, this is an outgoing policy, so you can set the maximum number of email recipients. That obviously is designed so that if somebody gets infected with a virus and your computer starts spamming out messages, that the number of recipients that it can contain is 100 or less. So if something happened and your computer started sending out a large amount of emails, if it was over 100 recipients, it would deny that traffic. Address length. This is defined by an RFC standard, and by default we have it set to 50 bytes. And what that means is literally between the username and the domain name, there can only be a maximum number of 250 characters, actually 254, because then you have a brackets on the side of it, which makes it 256. So that is an RFC standard. If you wanted, for whatever reason, to allow less than that, because you don't necessarily see a lot of domain names that are that long, or if the address is that long, it might be something that's spoofed. The maximum email size, that is the email size total. It includes the header, the body, and attachment size, not just the attachment size. So in this instance that I have here, I'm setting that the maximum email size is basically 10 meg outbound. That means that if for whatever reason the body, I had a really lengthy email that took up a lot of room, that my attachment that I could send might only be 8 meg. So you really got to keep in mind what is the maximum attachment size, and then, you know, kind of go from there. The email line length is the maximum length in an SMTP message before it receives a carriage return. And some email systems, if they're longer than 1,000 bytes, can actually cause buffer overflows. So it's a really good idea to set the maximum email line length. And then the maximum email header size, 20 bytes, that's the default standard there. The other thing I want to point out here that a lot of folks don't take advantage of is the hide the email server. So again, this is an outgoing proxy policy. So right here, I rewrite the hello domain so that when my mail server greets itself to other mail servers when I'm sending mail, it's going to announce itself as webmail.sargent-inc.com. Now, the internal mail server name that I have, and you'll see that in a couple of examples that I have here in a little bit, is actually exchange.sargent-inc.com. However, my DNS entry, my MX record, is for webmail. So I want to make sure that those correspond with each other. And I can actually, if we have some time, show you some examples on how you can manipulate that and what it does. Down here, you have the option of allowing UU encoded attachments and bin hex attachments. Again, this is outgoing. UU encoded is really kind of a deprecated encoding that means Unix to Unix, and you really don't see it much anymore, but it can be a very big security risk because the files that are sent out in that encoding are actually ASCII. They appear as ASCII, but they can actually contain executables. So you can see right away where outgoing and incoming might not be such a good thing for the UU encoded attachment. Bin hex is actually a Macworld attachment encoding, so you really don't see it very much. And unless you have a Mac mail server, you probably want to go ahead and disallow that as well. So here we have some extended SMTP settings. Excuse me. By default, in the standard SMTP proxy setup, we allow the E-turn and the 8-bit mine, but on an outbound, it's not a bad idea to allow BDAT chunking and binary mine. The BDAT chunking is an SMTP command that replaced the data command, and what it does is it sets it so that the SMTP host doesn't have to continuously scan for the end of data. This command sends the BDAT command with an argument that contains the number of bytes in the message, so the SMTP server already knows how big the message is going to be, and when it receives all the data, it just terminates the connection. The E-turn is allowed by default, but in some cases it might be, you know, some instances, some organizations might want to turn that off. What it is it's short for extended turn. So it's an extension to the SMTP mail delivery protocol that allows an SMTP server to request from another SMTP server any email message that it has for a specific domain. You find this most in ISPs that are queuing up mail for organizations. So if you had an organization, a mail server that wasn't online for some reason all of the time, and your messages were being queued at your ISPs, then that remote message queue starting is what then pulls those messages off of the other server. In the next tab, in our SMTP proxy, and again, this is, well, I'm still talking about the outgoing proxy, is we have the ability to actually set up TLS, transport layer security, with outbound mail servers, which, you know, security is what we're all about. So if we want to make sure that email has transport layer security encryption, then we want to go ahead and check the enable deep inspection of SMTP with TLS. Here's the default rule. So what it does is you can set up any kind of rules you want. So if you have specific domains that you want to have encrypted, have transport layer security sent, this does not encrypt the contents of the message. It just encrypts the transportation of the message. So if you wanted to enable it between specific domains or specific recipients, you have a lot of flexibility here to do that. I'll show you in a minute a couple of examples of TLS from messages that I've sent through my mail server. The next tab down on the SMTP outgoing is the content types. So by default, you can enable content type auto detection, or you can add rules in here to allow or disallow specific types. So if you didn't want people sending, you know, PDFs or Excel spreadsheets as attachments, or have other specific content type in their emails, then you can actually add rules here and deny or allow, etc. By default, you'll notice that we are A/B scanning all of them, so that we're at least going to scan anything that goes outbound from our network. The body encryption tab, and I'm not sure that a lot of folks know that this even exists. I don't remember what version of our Fireware OS this was enabled in. What this allows you to do is, if you're using client-side, you know, PGP type encryption, you can actually force users to encrypt their email based upon the from or the recipient or the sender. So if you have, you know, some HIPAA compliance that you need to, and you have an HR person that's sending email on a regular basis to another either domain or recipient of that domain, and you want to require that it's always encrypted, then you can set up rules here and enable it, so that if that HR person accidentally in, you know, Friday afternoon at 4:30 decides that they need to send a quick email, and they send it out and it's not encrypted, it will get kicked back because it won't be allowed based upon the rules that you have specified here. Here's a couple of my outbound messages that I wanted to point out. This is from my internal mail server, webmail.sargentinc.com. You'll notice that it's sent to Hotmail over TLS secured channel. That's important. I want to show you what happens when you turn that TLS off. See, I've got the correct domain name. Here's the content transfer encoding, and this was a header test. That's what that was all about. That's a pretty typical standard, you know, email header that you'd want to see. Now, I haven't gotten into the one part. We've been talking purely outbound, but here's a big thing that I wanted to talk about outbound is the headers. Because if you're not using an outbound proxy policy, if you're just using the default TCP UDP, or maybe you have a packet filter for outbound, you're missing a lot of the proxy policies security features, one of which is stripping headers that you don't want. So this is, as you can see, I sent an email with no outbound proxy policy. So in my configuration, I'll pull it up right here real quick. As you can see, here's my two inbound and outbound policies, and it says mail inside to mail outside because I'm using a one-to-one NAT. So even if you don't have a outbound proxy policy, but you're using a one-to-one NAT, it's always going to appear at the outside world as the correct IP address. This is not the IP address that's on my external interface. This is my one-to-one NAT. So that's good. We like to see that. However, because I don't have an outbound proxy policy and the headers aren't being stripped that I don't want to show, it leaks out these received headers from my Exchange server, which could definitely be a security risk. As you can see, it identifies the actual on-premise name of my Exchange server and the internal IP address. So if you're not using an outbound proxy policy with at least the default settings, you're not taking advantage of the stripping out of this. And if somebody gets an email message and they wanted to do some hacking or things like that, or some social engineering, they already have some information pertaining to your internal mail server. Here is another email message that I sent. You'll notice I sent in the subject, no outbound TLS. So I turned TLS off, so you can see right here, it went, it's fine, it's still stripping the receive headers and things of that nature, but there's no TLS encryption. Simply by turning that on and off in the outbound proxy policy is what enables that transport layer security. I want to talk a little bit about the incoming policies that we have and some of the settings here. If you compared them side by side, there's some very subtle differences on the setup of them. And again, the SMTP incoming.standard and SMTP outgoing.standard have a lot of great default settings that our security folks back at corporate have decided are good, that are going to allow free mail exchange, but at the same time provide you with a bare minimum of security for those. But we obviously want to be as secure as possible without hampering people's productivity. So again, here's the same limits. You can set a different maximum email size outgoing. Maybe you're okay sending a larger file than receiving a larger file. So those could be different here. Again, the maximum number of email recipients. Now, the maximum number of email recipients does not obviously read into distribution list. So if you have a distribution list called info at something, and that distribution list contains 100 users, the SMTP proxy doesn't. It uses the info at as one email address. Again, here is the hide email server. So I'm going to rewrite the message ID, and I'm going to rewrite the server replies in the banner domain to webmail.sergeantinc.com. If I didn't have this, if you telnetted to webmail.sergeantinc.com on port 25, you should get a banner. If I don't have that rewrite banner domain, it's going to give you the banner of the name of my mail server. Now I realize that there are some of these settings that you can do on your mail server, whether it be Exchange or Lotus Notes and things like that, that there's SMTP configuration that you can do on there that will accomplish the same thing. But from a pure security standpoint, why not do it on your security appliance rather than having your email administrator worry about security on the email? Again, here I have incoming. I don't allow the UU encoded attachments, but maybe I don't know who's going to be sending me emails, so maybe I'll allow the bin hex ones, which is the MAC standard. So here is the big difference, and I didn't show the headers on the outgoing or on the incoming, but here is here's the incoming. Excuse me, I didn't show the headers on the outgoing policy, but I am on the incoming. And the difference really is that here on the incoming headers, I'm allowing that received header, which I'm disallowing on the outbound. The reason being is I want to see who it's received from. So the default you'll see is if matched, allowed, if none matched, strip. So if a header is not in here, we're going to strip it by default. And let's see, I have a couple of other things that I wanted to show real quick. So give you a quick example of the, I wanted to give you a quick example of the server rewrites. So here is my, let's see, I want to do it on the inbound. So here's my SMTP incoming proxy. Here's my rewrite banner domain. I'm going to uncheck that for right now. And I'm going to save this configuration. And then look up the old MX toolbox. And let's see. I want to do a SMTP test of the email server. And it should come back in a minute, and instead of being the actual host name, it should come back and show you that exchange.sergeant. Excuse me. There we go. You'll notice right here, it came back with the banner of Exchange. So now I'm going to go back in. I'm going to edit that, and I'm going to put it back to webmail.sergeant.com. I'm going to save this back. That in. Now if I go back and I test this mail server again, you'll notice right here, now it's changed it back. So there's the banner. And this concludes my tech tips and tricks on SMTP and SMTP Proxy. I hope that some of the things that I've touched on were pertinent to you, or maybe will generate some more questions and interest in how we do things. Thank you very much for your time.